Hello, and welcome to the Kenneth I. Helfand Endowed Lecture. I'm David Buckley Borden. I'm a visiting professor within the Landscape Architecture Department at the School of Architecture and Environment. And today we have not one, but two outstanding guest speakers, Willow Long Anam and Allison Hirsch, both of whom will explore issues within their practice and expertise in the context of the lecture's theme of care of production. With that in mind, I am pleased to introduce our two speakers. Professor Willow Long Anam is Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth at University of Maryland, College Park. Willow's research focuses on issues of urban and suburban inequality, particularly related to issues of redevelopment, gentrification, racial segregation, immigration, and neighborhood opportunity. Willow is the author of Trespassers, Asian American and Battle for Suburbia, and a forthcoming book on redevelopment politics and equitable development organizing in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Professor Allison Hirsch is a landscape historian, theorist, and design, and associate professor and director of the master's program in landscape architecture and urbanism at the University of Southern California. Allison is also co-founder of Foreground Design Agency, a critical landscape practice that acts as a testing ground and ongoing collaborative platform. Author and editor of 2 books and many articles, Allison's current project, supported through the Landscape Architecture Foundation Fellowship for Innovation and Leadership, focuses on the productive landscapes of California's Great Central Valley, focused most particularly on the San Joaquin Valley as a landscape of extremes that embodies the most pressing socio-environmental questions of our day, especially as they pertain to global food production. We also have master's student in historic preservation, Hieronymo Roldan, a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture student, Isabel Ospina, and MLA student, Taylor Bowden, who will join us for a short Q&A. Please welcome Professors Hirsch and Langenbaum.
So I will admit, I struggled a bit with the prompt. At first I heard care of and thought, great, I'd talk about how my work pertains to timescales of care through feminist frameworks. But then the sub-theme for this particular lecture was introduced as production, and they seemed sort of at odds, because though I've been increasingly focused on working landscapes or landscapes of production, production has meant most to me the extraction of surplus value at the expense of people and land. So that sort of productionist logic or extractivist logic was clearly in opposition to practices of care which imply extended timescales. But my overall work actually focuses on the political or performative aspects of landscape and landscape architecture. So it considers both the sort of darker sides of production and what that has meant for landscape formation in terms of extraction of value, and landscapes and landscape architecture, how it can be socially, culturally, and politically productive. So today I actually decided to talk about very briefly my emphasis on some of my historical work on working landscapes, so the intersections of land and labor from a socially productive standpoint, but that positioned as a critique of capitalist modes of production, which would be the focus largely of the majority of the rest of the talk. So my initial consideration of landscape and labor was through a performative lens, looking specifically at collective acts of labor as forms of community development. And so I spent considerable time unpacking the activist work of landscape architect Carl Lynn, beginning in the 1960s, North Philadelphia, and the neighborhood commons he developed with his students and local residents in areas that had been cleared and land banked for urban renewal projects. The process of building these commons as a collective ritual paralleled what Lynn called rural barn raising, which to him was less about the physical outcome than the collective act of communal effort. So really in line with this idea of cooperative care. Lynn had spent much of his youth participating in the kibbutz movement in Israel, transforming parts of the desert into productive groves of citrus, as well as subsistence farms. It combined Zionism with socialism. So kibbutzim and their sense of shared purpose and close reliance on the land inspired Lynn, although I will say that he ultimately rejected Zionism. He was fiercely critical of industrial capitalism, where labor becomes commodified and divorced from the fruits of production. So building a neighborhood commons cooperatively was inspired by his early life experience. The anthropologist Melford Spiro in 1963 wrote a book on the kibbutz, and he talked about the idea of the kibbutz as based entirely on the moral value of labor, specifically on the land, as a quote, uniquely creative act, as well as the ultimate value. So the ideals of collective labor for the production and management of common assets drove Lynn's establishment of neighborhood commons in major cities nationwide. So clearly there's a sort of nostalgia for the pre-industrial in his work. So this idea of the use of ritual action for community development is contextualized in some of my writing within cultural anthropologist Victor Turner's contemporaneous theories on the ritual process as a means of achieving communitas, which is a Turner phrase. I recently watched the documentary series Wild Wild Country, which I imagine many of you are familiar with, and was struck by the collective act of labor aimed at transforming this landscape of human habitation. So I'm actually going through some of the archival documentation to understand the physical environment and how it was crafted by labor in a future publication. Here you see some of these theories of cooperative work in this park raising. It was actually called a park raising organized by SCAPE on 103rd Street in Harlem. With my interest in land and labor, I began rereading Raymond Williams's book, The Country and the City, where he distinguishes between the working country and landscape, which he claims erases the facts behind its production. I'll go back to that in a moment. So he uses this term working country as the flip side of landscape, where the realities of the working country make the fictions of landscape possible and manifest. Even celebrated projects such as this one that reclaim once industrial sites of landscapes or landscapes of waste, they're often stripped of their contested histories of struggle and inequity. So here, for instance, the alliance between the steel industry and the Nazi Party and the German use of prison labor in such sites of the industrial past, as well as the social impacts of deindustrialization of the West more generally, are erased in the process of making landscape. In landscape architectural practice, working landscapes and integrating maintenance into the choreography of landscape transformation has been an area of inquiry, but not as social critique, rather as a means to explore the extended temporal calendar of that landscape change requires. So urban agriculture has also been another way that landscape architects have considered work that goes into landscapes production. But while there have been some very meaningful investments in community agriculture for sustenance and economic empowerment, very little of that work has been critical of agro-industry and food security on a much larger scale. So the remainder of the talk will focus on this sort of research in progress, which considers Raymond Williams' off-cited claim that you saw on a previous slide as well, called, where he states a working country is hardly ever a landscape. And this I do through a close examination of the San Joaquin Valley, the southern portion of California's Great Central Valley. So the suppression of facts behind the production of a landscape intended for consumption severs the possibility for critical reflection on exploitative labor practices, resource extraction, environmental injustices, and spatial and environmental racism, which are very prevalent in the Valley, as you'll see. So the study offers an opportunity to sort of bring these back of house realities to the foreground as a form of critical landscape practice. For some context, the Central Valley is often referred to as the other California, and that's for its contrast to the California ingrained in our imaginations. Also its right political leanings, its climate and terrain, and its economies as the, quote, food basket of the world. So the San Joaquin Valley is the lower third of the 430-mile Central Valley. So this is the entire valley. It's very easy to decipher. I'm looking predominantly at the lower San Joaquin Valley, which is a hydrologic basin, the Tulare Lake Basin that cuts across 4 counties. Using fewer than 1% of US farmland, the larger Central Valley supplies 12% of the US agricultural output by value and produces a quarter of the nation's food, including 40% of the nation's fruits, nuts, and other table foods. It also has an ever increasing global market to places such as China, India, Mexico, the EU, and Canada. So my primary framework for investigation is related to the relationship of land and labor, but specifically laboring populations rendered invisible by capital-intensive agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. The intention is by looking at the intersections of land, labor, transcultural settlement and mobility, and agriculture to arrive at a landscape ethic for the working country and its connection to our global food system and its tenuous futures. So the project is actually currently supported by, as David mentioned, the LAF Fellowship in Innovation and Leadership alongside Roxy Thoren, and it situates landscape architecture as a critical practice that has the capacity to lead this effort. In 2019, the UN's IPCC released the report Climate Change and Land, which focuses most particularly on impacts of climate change on our global food supply. Here you're seeing what's called Cal EnviroScreen, which is actually a kind of vulnerability index, which measures environmental burdens against other population characteristics. So this general area is what we're looking at, but you can see actually very prominently the valley itself defined by the red areas, meaning they're extremely vulnerable. So the San Joaquin Valley is a nexus of some of the most pressing environmental questions of our day, pertaining particularly to global food production, including climate volatility, rising temperatures, exhausted water systems, degraded air quality, contaminated soils and groundwater, food insecurity despite the agribusiness economy, extreme environmental and social inequity that is a manifestation of generations of discriminatory practices, high concentrations of poverty, and unmanaged growth around its urban centers. In addition, current immigration policies have caused heightened fears of deportation and have created looser regulations for worker protections. The physical landscape of this capital-intensive agricultural model is laced with agrochemicals, animal waste lagoons, meat rendering plants and their byproducts, air and ground emissions of trucking and industrial processing, while groundwater has been extracted so dramatically and swiftly that the irreversibly collapsing aquifer is reshaping the face of the earth. Literally, subsidence can be detected from space in this landscape. So the valley has always remained outside Jefferson's agrarian idealism of the yeoman farmer living off the land. Clearly, this land had been originally occupied by indigenous peoples whose communities and connections to land were obliterated by colonial powers. The land additionally supported a diverse ecosystem, including prairies, oak grass savannas, desert grasslands, as well as riparian woodlands, actually predominantly looking in the upper slide, but exploring also what the occupation of this land prior to colonial settlement has meant. As many have observed before me, it is easy to see a kind of perfect embodiment of capitalist inequality in the San Joaquin Valley. I turn briefly back to The Country and the City and Williams's critique of the mythologized separation between rural virtue and urban greed, or civilized cities and rural ignorance. So really recognizing that exploitation and separation exploitation and inequality exists across the continuum. Williams suggests that, quote, there is an ideological separation between the processes of rural exploitation, which have been in effect dissolved into landscape, whereby the distance and privilege of the landscape view, the distanced view, blurs or dissolves the realities of lived experience. So in the San Joaquin Valley, like even if you sort of squinted your eyes, you would never be fooled into an illusion of the pastoral ideal. The sheer scale of agricultural extent dissolves working realities by the sort of relentless lines that cut through the vastly depopulated territories to the horizon. So even in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, as the Joad family summits the Tehachapi Pass and overlooks the valley, which actually the cover image is actually a perfect illustration of this, they describe what lays before them in that landscape view: the vineyards, orchards, farmhouses, and then Winfield says aloud as he looks down on the valley, there's fruit. And so he sees nothing of what that will mean in terms of their everyday struggle to come. And clearly it's impossible to speak of the valley without recognizing that all development in the West owes itself to the successes and failures of water extraction, conveyance, and allocation. So transported over vast distances and heights, government subsidized water has defined the extremes of inequality that characterize the valley. the combination of 1930s New Deal sponsored effort to bring in the Central Valley Project, which is actually pictured in perfect purple. You can sort of barely see the differentiation here. And the state-sponsored California Water Project, which is in slightly lighter purple here and here. They brought irrigation water from Northern California to the south through large canals, aqueducts, dams, reservoirs, and pumping plants. So surface water rights are reserved for farmers, with large-scale farm operations, the most capable at maneuvering the system to output small farms. So while the majority of the valley's residents are left to rely on groundwater for drinking. And that might not have mattered were it not for chemical runoff from pesticides and fertilizers that concentrate due to the particularities of the valley's geologic profile and the retreating aquifer due to over-extraction. So through the complete reshaping of the hydrology in the region, the valley became one of the most productive landscapes in the world. Here's a construction of a groundwater well. And even though these major infrastructure projects provided enough water to supply what Reisner in Cadillac Desert says is 8 cities the size of New York, it has not been enough to meet the rising water demands of a growing industrial agricultural region. So as a result, growers turned to groundwater wells to supplement their surface water, leading to overpumping, the depletion of the aquifer, and ultimately land subsidence, particularly in what is referred to as the Westlands Water District. I'm just going to move you guys over, and this is largely the area I'm talking about. So some of the wells actually, including this one likely, they actually go into the Tulare Lake bed almost 2,500 feet to get fresh water. So clearly only farmers with abundant financial resources can afford to drive a well that deep. And the rest are typically left with dry wells, often contaminated by agrochemicals. So because of the massive land holdings by the Spanish missions and then the Mexican ranchos, land transfers of these parcels set the framework for industrial scale agriculture. The California gold rush of the mid-19th century instilled this sort of feverish capitalist spirit, which focused on enterprise, or the California dream, which translated into bonanza farming of wheat, or what many people call sort of mining for wheat. That actually then transitioned to fruit and vegetable farming after the bust of the world wheat market in the 1880s, which just decreased the scale of land holding slightly, while it was actually not unusual for a landholder to hold several 100,000 acres still, but it actually did not diminish the economics of scale. So it actually also dramatically increased the reliance on irrigation water. And in Fresno County and throughout the San Joaquin Valley during the late 19th century, attempts were made to draw populations to buy land in California in what were called farming colonies of small farms by guaranteeing water rights for irrigation. And I like to actually create this contrast here because it's almost the perfect embodiment of that distinction that Williams is making between the construction of landscape, the image, and the working realities on the ground. Many of those efforts at colony settlement were actually unsuccessful, where water was scarce, and farm operations then remained rather large in these particular areas. This is a brochure for Allensworth, which was a town founded by and for African Americans in 1908 as a quote unquote race colony, where irrigation water was actually never delivered in sufficient supply as promised by the Pacific Farming Company, which is the land development firm that handled the original purchase. In the advent of sort of abundant and heavily subsidized water facilitated the development of large farms of labor-intensive vegetable, fruit, and increasingly nut crops, while it afforded many farmers the opportunity to also operate dairy farms and cattle ranches. So most of the valley today is heavily dependent on an abundant supply, not only of water, but of seasonal workers. Which brings me largely to the topic of the rest of the talk. With diversified specialty crop farming, labor became an increasing issue. And what was needed to operate these capital intensive farms was a highly mobile wage labor force, preferably to farmers in oversupply so they could keep wages low. Geographer Don Mitchell, he wrote a great book called The Lie of the Land. He summarizes that complex labor history really succinctly, so I'm going to quote him. He says, quote, "It is the very history of California agriculture that turned toward first Chinese, then Japanese labor, the vicious alien land laws, the importation of Mexicans under armed guards during World War I, the rejection of Filipino labor between the wars because it could not be deported, the violent strikes among Mexican workers in the early 1930s, and hence the turn to poor white labor fleeing the droughts on the plains, the Bracero program, or the importation of contract labor from Mexico during World War I, which is what you're actually seeing pictured here, the struggles of the United Farm Workers, the turn to Central America, as well as economically depressed regions of Mexico for quote unquote illegals. And then the long struggle to rationalize patterns of migrancy and settlement to assure that buying labor at peak production times could be done so as to spatially distance the costs of reproduction. And here you're actually seeing, farm workers being sprayed down after a day's work by agrochemicals. It was during the Great Depression and the real realities of the working country became visible, largely because it was white bodies that were the subject of suffering. So this visibility was shaped through the writings of John Steinbeck, as I mentioned, the journalism of Kerry McWilliams and his famous book, Factories in the Field, and the Farm Security Administration photographs, such as Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother series. The government tried to shift that narrative by these FSA-sponsored migrant camps that were designed by architects and landscape architects such as Garrett Ekbo, Vernon DeMars, which were constructed for white workers in an effort to both placate and control farm worker labor agitation, and that was becoming more prevalent at the time. So housing this labor force has been the subject of great debate and division over the past 150 years. Grower provided migrant quarters, federal labor camps, bracero camps, shanty towns turned unincorporated settlements. They represent the sort of shifting face of farm labor housing. And in more recent decades, farmers faced with new strict farm labor housing standards and regulations have chosen to close their labor camps. So by removing thousands of labor camps that were once provided to most of the state's farm workers, the work of finding and paying for housing has been outsourced to the sort of under-resourced farm workers themselves who are unable to pay for market rate housing, so live in crowded, substandard conditions. And fruit and vegetable picking or field picking, which is often stoop labor. We're seeing this hierarchy I'll talk about in a minute. That's often a one-generation job, since the heat and physical toll combined with exploitations by what are often called farm labor contractors, I'll talk about those in a minute, make it preferable to work in the processing or packing plant where you can stand upright and be free of pesticides, though typically for the same low wages. That means that a constant supply of immigrant laborers willing to do the work is required. So what you're seeing here is actually are diagrams by medical anthropologist Seth Holmes, showing ethnic and racial hierarchies on the farm. And here's this, if it comes up. Yeah, that's too bad. Let's try one more time. No, okay. Slide didn't go through or something. Speech poly. Nope, okay, one slide didn't come through. So the demand for cheap labor has been filled by the most vulnerable. Today, many indigenous Mexicans from the southern regions of Oaxaca and Guerrero have been crossing the border in numbers since the 1970s and represent most of the undocumented farm worker population in California. So we're talking about regions in southern Mexico right about here. This is actually a drawing just showing what the routes are, the sort of undocumented routes are to get over the border. And as I mentioned, farm labor contractors, growers have actually opted to evade both union and government pressures by divesting themselves of their field workforce and now rely on this model of the farm labor contractor. And they've become the sort of main recruiter and employer of short-term and temporary crop workers. The growth in use of farm labor contractors, or FLCs, is attributable to the fact that farm labor contractors and provide seasonal workers, but while assuming responsibility for virtually all aspects of labor management. And that includes worker recruitment, supervision and payment, employment-related paperwork, taxes and insurance, drinking water and field sanitation, safety training and equipment. So in exchange, most FLCs charge a commission of generally 30 to 40%. And correspondingly, most farmers no longer need to offer housing as an inducement to attract workers, which has been a major factor in the sort of widespread tearing down of labor camps, particularly on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. So the principal commodity is an abundant supply of sort of tractable workers, which are often victims of historically exploitative FLC practices. They are typically obtained by tapping into the FLC's binational networks, which targets Indigenous workers in particular. And so as a result of this sort of continued immigration and the loss of labor camps by the 1980s, scores of rural towns were transformed into farm labor enclaves. And the FLC model has made it possible for once migratory workers who followed the harvest up through Washington state and then down to Mexico throughout each year to actually settle in the San Joaquin Valley and work in different capacities, in the field for an extended season of diverse crops, as well as in the factory. So this sort of stereotype of migratory farm worker has still remained, sort of convincing those with power throughout the decades to avoid the question of permanent affordable housing for a population upon which the world depends. But the reality actually is increasingly there are opportunities to settle in place. City and county plans from the 60s and 70s present a pattern of underinvestment and exclusion through land use designations that discourage development in low-income unincorporated communities in favor of existing urban areas while protecting prime agricultural lands from urban encroachment. So during the early and mid 20th century, communities developed actually on the edges of cities where industry was concentrated and housing was more affordable. So as cities expanded, they often annexed land that excluded communities of color, creating islands of these unincorporated settlements, the exclusion and neglect of which have been reinforced by the state's taxation and land use policies, such as here. You see the case of Malaga, it's actually pronounced Malaga, early on being remote, in the early 20th century, a sort of remote outpost of the city. The city grew up around it, but it is still not incorporated into the city, so doesn't benefit from a number of its public services or municipal services. From the Tulare General Plan of 1972, it stated, quote, public commitments to communities with little or no authentic future should be carefully examined before final action is initiated. These non-viable communities would, as a consequence of withholding major public facilities, such as sewer and water systems, enter a process of long-term natural decline as residents depart for improved opportunities in nearby communities. So it sounds very similar to planned shrinkage ideas today, but these communities actually never declined, but densified as more arrived to stay, but they can continue to be barred from such opportunities. And here you're actually seeing Fairmead here. In the center of the slide is a historically Black town settled in the 1930s and 40s, and the city of Chowchilla here in the sort of northwest of the slide, which recently annexed land adjacent to Fairmead on which 2 prisons now stand, but not Fairmead itself. So this continues to sort of deny this community access to the most basic features of a safe, healthy, and sustainable neighborhood, most essentially potable water and sewer, but more generally, safe housing, public transit, parks, sidewalks, street lights, and so on. So again, water access is what registers inequality and fuels it. Not included within municipal water systems that treat and distribute water, these unincorporated community residents rely on a fragmented patchwork of small and underperforming systems that predominantly rely on groundwater. Many of which ran dry in the wells that ran dry in 2015 to 17. So actually in a recent article in the New York Times, the author Jose de Reale says, quote, today, the legacy of segregation in the Central Valley reverberates underground through old pipes, dry wells, and soil tainted by shoddy septic systems. And here you're actually seeing photographs from a much larger series by photographer Ernest Lowe documenting Black farm workers in the 1960s. And you're seeing on the right a man hauling drinking water by bucket and barrel in Teviston. So the lingering effects of this kind of isolation are especially clear in a handful of rural towns that once provided refuge for thousands of Black farm workers. The first Black farm workers came to the San Joaquin Valley in the late 19th century following the Chinese Exclusion Act. At the time, cotton was becoming a crucial crop in the region, and local farmers recruited Black farm workers from the South. So as Black people moved into the valley, many cities responded with racist land policies, which segregated them either through laws or outright violence. And it was actually, it was just because these communities didn't have water, or the lack of water, that made it possible for them to settle there. So documenting this history of the quote unquote Black Okies, the author Mark Audock says, quote, "In a new land of tall cotton, old Jim Crow had stalked them west." These small towns are now predominantly Latinx and are among the first to lose water when drought comes, as it did persistently during the drought of 2015 to 17. When water does flow, it's often tainted with chemicals, including nitrates from fertilizers, nearby cattle ranching and dairies, as well as failing septic systems, and arsenic and coliform in above legal limits. So zooming in from the valley to the town to the body, it is what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence and toxic layering inflicted on the body as a registration of landscape that actually makes corporately manifest the inequities of this peri-urban and rural system. There's an anthropologist, Devera Saxton, who traces these logics, these sort of toxic legacies and pesticide drifts through farm worker clothing and bodies, or through the air, water, and soil. And she notes that much of the scientific focus and intervention efforts have focused on mitigating acute exposures, yet more and more scientific evidence links pesticides to short and long-term health problems. And those include neurological deterioration, reproductive health problems, learning disabilities, cancer, endocrine disruption, and metabolic disorders. The vast majority of the valley's unincorporated community residents are people of color who also face cumulative impacts from environmental contamination brought on by proximity to air pollution, pesticides, toxic facilities, and waste disposal. So again, to quote Saxton, she says, quote, "Embodiment includes the sometimes visible and the sometimes invisible social, cultural, political, economic, and ecological processes wherein people and communities literally incorporate biologically the social and material world in which they live." And that latter part of the quote is actually citing the epidemiologist Nancy Krieger. So in the modern orchard, sort of entanglements of plants, soils, chemicals, and bodies as manifest in the acute and chronic illnesses suffered by farm workers leads to what many have called andando muerte, or walking death. And that walking death is itself evidence that the boundaries between bodies and landscapes are never complete. The toxified landscape is in stark contrast to the symbolism of fruit, which was integral to the California dream. Some have argued that the abundant fertility of this sort of biblical image of fruit production offers a kind of rural civility in complete contrast to the Wild West attitude of wheat that came before it. But Don Mitchell, who I cited earlier, he sort of rightfully challenges this misguided representation of the civilizing nature of growing fruit, recognizing its inherent injustices. Even after Steinbeck writes of Winfield, who exclaims, "From the Tehachapi Pass, there's fruit," his much later chapter, so one of his intro chapters on chapter 25, focuses on the odor of sweet decay, of ferment and rot, or the grapes of wrath, caused by industrial farming, where large land owners drive the price of labor down, and the small farmer, who to Steinbeck pours his sweat into the land, cannot afford to harvest it. And here the argument is taken further, where the rot actually becomes contamination. So more optimistically, just as Mitchell argues in his book, The Lie of the Land, this has always been a landscape of resistance. It's sort of different from the highly visible efforts of unions that became symbolic of labor justice. Since the early 20th century, we have seen these increasingly smaller tactical and multi-pronged approaches to resist the uneven development and toxic burdens of low-income communities of color in the San Joaquin Valley. And I'll just show you a couple before concluding. This is actually Self-Help Enterprises, which was founded in 1965 by the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker service organization. It developed as an outgrowth of a successful self-help housing project completed in Goshen, near Visalia, in San Joaquin Valley's Tulare County. So it's an organization founded on principles of economic and racial justice, initially focusing on farm working communities in the San Joaquin Valley. And it followed on the establishment of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which was part of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs, where self-help sought Office of Economic Opportunity funding to obtain land and develop into sustainable building lots, inform low-income communities of the availability of the program in their area, assist eligible families in the submittal of an application to qualify for a loan, and then provide the supervision during construction. And so they provide housing assistance working on the basis of what's called sweat equity, where 8 to 12 families are grouped together and agree to help one another build their houses, while these labor hours are then used as the down payment. And they're still actively working in the Valley. This is a recent construction site on the left. But while funding sources and models have changed and diversified, including with self-help taking on home lending, they continue to be a force of change in the San Joaquin Valley, with broader impacts on water justice in unincorporated communities and other infrastructural improvements for and with these communities. Another organization of an example of a land-based resistance features the National Land for People. It was a group that was less successful achieving their aims, but collaborated with self-help enterprises in response to injustices, specifically in their case, impacting farm workers and aspiring predominantly minority growers in the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, or what's referred to as the Westlands Water District. Here you actually see they're mapping out of corporate land deals. In this west side, actually you can see the Westlands here. Corporate land holdings and sort of corrupt land and water deals made it impossible for small growers to survive. And so the National Land for People was a movement for land and rural reform that attempted to homestead farm workers in the Westlands Water District in the 1970s by using legal measures and litigation in Washington to enforce what was the Reclamation Law of 1902. And until 1982, there was a law in the book, the 1902 Reclamation Law, or Reclamation Act, that limited the size of farms allowed to use government subsidized irrigation water. And it limited them to 160 acres. It also required that the farm owner be on site, living on site. So it's a residency requirement. And that unenforced law was meant to be an important safeguard against consolidation of land, power, and wealth in the developing West. The National Land for People tried to sort of call attention to the lack of enforcement, but was ultimately squashed by the administration of Ronald Reagan, who was the California governor in 1982 with the Reclamation Reform Act. And interestingly, the National Land for People, they ran well-attended and publicized seminars in reality, it's a term they used, or agricultural reality tours. You're seeing a very loosely sketched out route here, but they were intended to expose the social and environmental injustices legible in the landscape and to sort of elucidate the unequal flows of capital and water that govern rural life in the San Joaquin Valley in order to build momentum and support for alternative socio-environmental orders. So here you're seeing coverage of these reality tours in the local paper. Oops. And today, the National Land for People set the sort of foundation for a complex network of advocacy and justice organizations making real strides in the Valley. Today, there are many fighting for pesticide regulation, water justice, and utility reparations, improved living and working conditions, including farm worker health, and supportive services to small immigrant farmers who are seeds of resistance against climate change and environmental injustice. My own work, learning from these past and current efforts, is an attempt to synthesize the challenges and possibilities and use landscape architecture and design to imagine the landscape otherwise in these sort of new narratives of justice and equity. And to conclude, I'm just going to show a couple, just sort of frame where the research is going. So the intended outcomes of this research are an exhibition and book. They're split into two. One's a real sort of cultural study of the San Joaquin Valley focused on histories and current practices. The second component of this is the futures component, but for the histories component, which I've largely mapped out for you as it's in its early formation, uses these archival artifacts, photographs, and texts, and my own drawings and mappings that synthesize this history and active present, and then reveals the realities that I've discussed that have long been hidden or marginalized. So the intention is to sort of transform the narrative of agriculture in the Valley by bringing to recognition the histories and practices rendered silent. The futures, the forward-looking component of the exhibition, will feature these visual scenarios across scales that present possible futures of this working landscape. However, rather than sort of speculations, the intention is not only to imagine alternatives, but to use sort of deep research into histories and current practices to understand possibilities and places for intervention for justice initiatives in laboring communities. And as a part of early ideation, I thought, knowing this would be distributed to students, I actually worked with some students early on to start the sort of ideation. And here, Isabel Jimenez considers the invisibility of toxins permeating farm working communities as a form of slow violence, particularly looking at the effects of groundwater contamination. Here, she selects case studies, communities that were deemed the most sort of vulnerable by CalEnviroscreen. And here, she's really looking at community players already active in the area to optimize on assets already in place, and ultimately to generate strategies to achieve community control over water resources and steward in changes to water policy. Another student, Alex Nuffer, he considered the impacts of herbicides on plants, soils, and bodies. And he likewise sort of recognized that there is a lot of fallowed land currently due to drought, which has become host to an array of what are deemed agricultural weeds or ruderal seeds, the same weeds that herbicides are targeting. Here you're seeing 1985 sort of aerial view and what the sort of subsequent impact of years of drought and over-extraction have done to the land. So he cataloged these ruderal seeds, what are often called weeds, and claiming that many have significant environmental and or cultural value, and then came up with sort of building soil and land management techniques on these fallowed and impaired lands. That's a technical definition of impaired lands that offer a new calendar of embodied labor. And so through this sort of this managed disturbance process that promotes ruderal seed dispersal on variant topographic and microclimatic conditions, he developed this sort of alternative form of labor where the cultivation of plants would be based on foraging practices. So this quote unquote sort of rural agricultural system the idea of it was to serve as a foundation for a new community driven economic model based on cooperative ownership and equitable agricultural labor practices. And clearly it's visionary. And so I end here really with this slide just to really emphasize that the ultimate aims of my research is to develop a series of futures, not just to sort of speculate on alternatives, but to really map out specific ways forward that negotiate the mechanisms through which to navigate to arrive at these possible alternatives. I think I have one more slide. I can find my mouse. Oh, and that, yes, that sort of brings me back to the theme of care of, where the earlier models of care and cooperation I showed will most certainly inspire ways of crafting the future while trying to sort of reconcile the extent of agricultural output of the San Joaquin Valley on which the world has learned to depend. So the ultimate goal is to sort of challenge current environmentally driven or extractivist environmental paradigms, the sort of land as resource model, and imagine a more healthful global future. That's it, thanks.
Thank you, Allison. I really appreciate your critical work and the exploration of the care of production theme. You've given us a lot to unpack. Before we shift to our Q&A session, I would like to welcome Willow Long Amam to present her work on issues of urban and suburban inequality.
Well, thank you, David, for moderating this discussion. Allison, that was a fabulous talk. I think we share some things in common, but it should be fascinating to put these two things side by side. I'm going to talk less about the sort of formalized practice of landscape architecture and more concretely around issues of land value. And I think we do share that in common in terms of thinking about issues of extraction of surplus value, and certainly around strategies of landscape resistance. We're going to move from the regional to the hyperlocal and from the rural to suburban and think about issues of landscape transformation in a suburban context. And for me, specifically in the Washington, D.C. area, so we're also moving from west to east coast. The talk that I'm going to give today is focused on a larger book project that I've been working on for several years now, thinking about landscapes of resistance in a suburban context for a larger book project focused on sort of intersection around the suburbanization of poverty and redevelopment that we see happening in suburbs today, and thinking about how this has moved discussions of gentrification outside of its traditional center city context, and how communities are organizing to fight back. And this is all based on sort of thinking about communities in the Washington, D.C. that are currently undergoing significant transformation. So to give you some context for thinking about that transformation in terms of population changes, the map on the left that you see here shows poverty by race in 1980, and then on the left in 2010. And what it shows you is that in 1980, there were significant concentrations of poverty inside the borders of Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. being roughly this diamond shape right here, and was largely African-American poverty in 1980. By 2010, you see a much more dispersed pattern of poverty, while still largely African-American and still primarily inside the borders of Washington, D.C. You see a lot more poverty growing inside of the suburbs, a lot more diverse patterns of who constitute the poor. So particularly Latinx populations inside some of the inner ring suburbs of the Washington, D.C. area. And you've also at the same time seen a massive transformation of our suburban built environments. So this is a map showing the region by population density. And what it shows you is that you have some areas outside of the borders of Washington, D.C. that are just as dense as the city itself. And so if we were to ask the question, what are you calling suburban by density, we would have trouble distinguishing some of our suburbs from our traditional downtown central city. Washington, D.C. has a long history of edge cities and some dense suburban downtowns, but in recent years, many of these areas have been transformed by redevelopment, by so-called suburban retrofitting, particularly in Maryland, which is known as the smart growth state, leading the nation in terms of some of its smart growth policies that have really focused development around existing quote unquote urban areas, which are in fact part of the DC suburbs. And these patterns together, I think, force some of our conversations that traditionally focus on areas inside the city to focus on other geographies of gentrification. What geographer Martin Phillips called these other examinations of other geographies, because we've largely seen the focus of the work be almost exclusively on urban environments. And so the reasons for that become somewhat clear when you look at some of the maps of gentrification. The one on the left being from the National Coalition, Community Reinvestment Coalition, that in 2013 to 2017 found the Washington, D.C. area to be one of the most intensely gentrified cities in the US, but many of the areas that have already gentrified or are eligible to gentrify are actually outside of the Washington, D.C. border. Now, I wouldn't want to get into a debate over how we measure gentrification, but depending on how you pick indicators and what years you select, some could say that that map could even look different. The map on the right is one that one of my students did, looking at areas that had already gentrified and finding a slightly different geography. And highlighted here in the red boundary is the community of Silver Spring that I'm going to be talking about more today. So the larger book project, which is tentatively titled The Right to Suburbia, Redevelopment and Resistance on the Urban Edge, really looks at the impacts of these trends on low-income communities of color, largely Latinx and African American communities in the DC suburbs, and how communities themselves are organizing to fight back. It looks at 3 case studies of communities that have undergone these pressures and narrates the on-the-ground efforts of activists, organizers, business, and community leaders to resist the forces of gentrification and claim a more equitable stake in suburbia's future. It's been informed by key interviews with key stakeholders, activists, planners, policymakers, and content analysis of planning and development documents and historical archives, and a lot of mapping of data from housing, affordable housing, and small businesses in these communities. And the talk that I'm gonna focus on today is the first of these case studies, which is in downtown Silver Spring, which is one of the earliest cases of large-scale redevelopment in the Maryland suburbs, and one where they generated a large reaction from the community and some of the first and early roots of equitable development activism in the suburbs. So the larger book project really focuses on how the importance of sort of thinking about gentrification from the perspective of suburbia. It argues that some of the spatial, institutional, social, and political structures of suburbia have actually exacerbated the vulnerabilities that disadvantaged groups face in redeveloping neighborhoods, and that activism has been really central to steadily building the capacity of communities to respond or resist some of the pressures of gentrification. I have here a photo from Ferguson, because I think Ferguson really focused the eyes of the nation on activism that was happening not in the inner city of St. Louis, but on its suburbs, and caused many to question how such conditions could arise in a relatively unknown community, at least from a national standpoint, far from the center of St. Louis. But we've seen actually that political movements have often, though silently, been happening in suburbs. And so I think it's important to draw attention not only to the kind of activism that has long existed in suburbs, but also the ways in which suburban built environments, political environments, social environments differ from those of inner cities, and therefore have a lot to do with how we address some of the disparate impacts of gentrification on communities. So in this chapter, I argue that through an examination of the past half century of development politics in Silver Spring, I look at some of the battles that have been won and lost over Silver Spring's downtown future, and how it moved from a growing population of middle-class whites to a period that many long-term residents and county leaders characterized as decline. The latter corresponding with the settlement of new African-American suburbanites and the growing population of new immigrants, particularly those from Ethiopia and other parts of Africa, and the subsequent white flight and commercial development that ensued in downtown Silver Spring. So the chapter argues that some of these narratives of decline around and the spatial comfort of white middle class really preface the efforts of the county to take a heavy-handed role in cleaning up the downtown and making it quote unquote safe for business and new residents. And it justified the county's massive spending that made way for its redevelopment. But it also helped to minimize the impacts that were disproportionately felt by African and African American and immigrant business owners and residents. And so it shows how some of the early roots of equitable development movement in the DC suburbs were started, but also some of the hard lessons that were learned by early activists and county leaders about the grassroots capacity, the political policy tools, and capacity needed in order to achieve more equitable outcomes. So here I have a picture of downtown Silver Spring from the 1920s. And this shows Silver Spring as one of the area's earliest downtowns. It was a railroad come automobile suburbs located just on DC's, northeast border, and was a popular home for many early working class and middle class whites beginning in the 1920s. Many of these were fleeing or avoiding more racially integrated areas of Washington, D.C., and were attracted to Silver Spring's many amenities and its quiet, homogeneous neighborhoods. It was, even before this period, largely an elite haven for wealthy white Washingtonians who became some of its early community builders, became some of its early developers. In the 1930s and 40s, during the rush of New Deal workers that came to the Washington, D.C. area, many white middle class settled directly into the suburbs, like downtown Silver Spring. And the area became one of the region's first automobile suburbs and the quote, the downtown of the northern suburbs. Some of the regions had some of the region's earliest shopping centers, like pictured here, the Silver Spring Shopping Center that contained Hecht's and many other businesses that were leaving downtown during the period. But it was also highly restrictive. So redlining, racial covenants, steering, and other racist real estate practices helped to protect many of the middle-class neighborhoods and make them exclusively white and grow the wealth of residents within them. African Americans, while they sometimes worked in downtown Silver Spring, in the homes and the businesses, were not allowed to sit in the restaurants or go into many of its stores. And instead, they made their life in close-knit African-American suburbs nearby, like Littonsville, Maryland, a community that was established by free slaves and later became the subject of multiple urban renewal attempts itself, and shares some of the history that Allison pointed to around the denial of water and sewer services as well. They fought for fair housing and open accommodations laws in the counties that eventually helped to open up downtown Silver Spring to new residents and migration. But as African Americans began to settle in downtown Silver Spring and were later joined by diverse immigrants, established white residents and businesses left or fortified themselves into more middle-class residential enclaves. So particularly, it was a particularly popular destination for many middle-class African-Americans and Black businesses that were leaving DC following the 1968 uprisings that followed the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. But as African-Americans began to move in, many whites then fled the downtown and many of its outlying residential communities for further out exurban communities like Wheaton, which I also focus on in the larger book project. But some middle-class neighborhoods remained largely unchanged, and residents chose to stay, and as many said, to fight for their downtown. Commercial businesses also left, leading to this period that many call Silver Spring's decline. You saw many businesses begin to be lured away to more exurban shopping centers like that of Wheaton Plaza, one of the county's first regional shopping centers. And so you do see an increasing commercial vacancy rates, but more so this larger perception around the vacancy of downtown and the clear discomfort that it caused for many middle-class white residents and county leaders, many of whom I talked to and would call downtown Silver Spring during this period anything from a ghost town to what one former planning director called its see-through era, where literally there was nobody in the downtown. Oftentimes people refer to a kind of cannonball metaphor in which you could literally shoot a cannonball down Georgia Avenue, which is its main thoroughfare, and not hit anybody because it was so vacant downtown. But this narrative of decline really was defied by the reality of many other residents, predominantly working class African Americans and new immigrants that lived in many of the neighborhoods during the time, particularly in the apartment communities south of Silver Spring, and had kept the downtown afloat during this period. Many of the new immigrant communities from Southeast Asia and Central America and East Africa, again, primarily Ethiopia, settled into these apartments that were pioneered by African Americans a generation earlier. They started businesses, playing on the sidewalks and parks, and really build a strong sense of community in those neighborhoods. Their invisibility, as well as the sense of discomfort that their presence caused amongst many of the white civic and business leaders of the period, prefaced the county's urgent calls about the need to redevelop downtown and reestablish its rightful place in the county. So you began to see, starting in the mid-1980s, really aggressive efforts to revitalize the downtown. So on the left, you see a map here of the many different incentives and layers of redevelopment that the county helped to incentivize during the period, including an enterprise zone and other incentives for big developers to come in. This momentum really grew amongst Silver Spring's property and business elites as the image of downtown to change the image of downtown. They were eager to respond to some of the community demands they were hearing, particularly from the white middle class neighborhoods, and buffer some of the financial impacts to the county. So they began to pour massive resources and adopt a pretty heavy-handed approach to revitalization. This included efforts to sort of clean up some of the image of downtown and spur redevelopment. They cleared many of the hurdles to redevelopment for large developers. They began by purchasing many of the smaller parcels, assembling them, tearing down vacant buildings, and clearing the land. In 1993, they adopted a new sector plan that added many residential and mixed uses into the downtown and increased much of the densities throughout the downtown. And they were successful in attracting many early major redevelopment proposals for the downtown. So in the late 1980s, you had Silver Triangle, which was a proposal for a 400,000 square foot super block for the affluent. That's what one former county council member called it. And a couple years later, the American Dream proposal. So the Silver Triangle proposal went south. The county issued another RFP to attract a new developer. And this one from the Mall of America developers was meant to be a 27-acre mega mall and entertainment complex with indoor roller coasters, what one county council member called Hershey Park in the middle of suburbia, that ultimately struggled to get financing and was not approved by the county. But it wasn't just the financial struggles of these proposals, it was also the opposition by some of what I would call suburbia's old school activists. This is the more traditional power structure of business leaders and long-term residents that were actually opposed to both of these proposals, largely because of their impacts to the middle-class communities in terms of traffic and some of the destruction of downtown's historic character. So these residents who had quote unquote stuck it out were incensed over downtown's condition really drive the discourse about the need to redevelop, but also drive what development is supposed to look like. And neither of these proposals really fit their image of what they wanted for their new downtown. But throughout the period, they still got several concessions, including new traffic mitigation infrastructure and plans to preserve more of the downtown, particularly its Art Deco buildings and some of the places that residents called historic that in fact had very little historic value. The pictures you see here are of Tasty Diner, which residents frequently went to, that you can see got moved from its former location right in the center of downtown to make way for redevelopment, but got relocated just on its outskirts in this building that many people called historic, but was found to have little historic actual value. Meanwhile, the residents who stood the most to lose from redevelopment, including some of its low-income residents, immigrants, and other communities of color, were largely marginalized from the process. So while the period put in place the bones for large-scale redevelopment, it also signaled that the road ahead for these communities to find a voice in the process and a place in the new downtown would be hard won. So, downtown Silver Spring is often considered a suburban success story. It's often, its downtown revitalization is often sort of cast across the nation as one of the most successful suburban redevelopment projects. But I put a question mark here because I think we really need to think hard about the impacts of what suburban redevelopment meant in downtown Silver Spring. So what happened after the rejection of this American Dream project is the county set itself up to play a much larger role in ensuring that downtown redevelopment would happen. So under a newly elected county executive, Doug Duncan, the county tried to maintain momentum for redevelopment, but with a different focus and process. And so instead of one large redevelopment project, the county would solicit smaller development projects and would maintain some of the existing fabric and character that some of the old school activists were so worried about. And they would work with community groups, largely its neighborhood associations, to come up with a new proposal. So less than a year after the American Dream died, Duncan announced that the county had entered negotiations with a new team of developers, a local team known as Folger Pratt and Peterson Companies, to build a new town center on this now prime county-owned downtown, as the county, through its assembly process, came to own almost all of the downtown Silver Spring land. So Doug Duncan's largely charged with making redevelopment happen. Under his leadership, the county even began even more aggressive acquisition, assembly, and clearing of property, and making major infrastructure improvements, and began a program known as the Urban Crew and Corps program that would act as goodwill ambassadors and provide security in the downtown and help residents and visitors feel safe in the downtown. He minimized community opposition by appointing a new Silver Spring steering committee with whom the developer was required to confer. The steering committee was largely made up of Silver Spring civic and business elites. The public meetings continued to be not dominated by these old guard civic leaders. But desperation over redevelopment forced consensus that had previously not come together amongst this old guard. And in 1997, the final plans for this large-scale 26-acre, $1 million mixed-use concept was approved. So this adopted a more traditional new urbanist approach to downtown with walkable streets and retail frontage, a main street and plaza, and received lots of support from county officials as well as, quote unquote, the community. But largely disregarded was the voices of many that oppose this process, which I'll talk about in just a second. But this project has spurred a lot of other development in the area and was underwritten by even further county incentives, such as an arts and entertainment district, a county green tape zone, an urban district, and the subsidy of new downtown anchors like AFI Silver Theater, Discovery, and some other commercial chains in the early 2000s. And the county then touted many of its early indicators of success, such as the declining office vacancy rates, major new residential developments, including between 1990 and 2010, about 3,000 new housing units, and median home values, incomes, and education that were on the rise. But as this new vision emerged, so too did some of the grassroots activism. And so while some of the more traditional neighborhood groups continued to rally against traffic and for historic preservation, activism also emerged amongst some of the new immigrant communities, African-American communities, African communities that were largely working class communities in the apartment communities in South Silver Spring. So under the umbrella of a newly formulated organization called Impact Silver Spring, the equitable development movement coalesced for one of the first times in the DC suburbs over the fate of downtown Silver Spring. So Impact Silver Spring was really born out of the frustration over the lack of diversity in the redevelopment process. Frankie Blackburn, who was appointed to the redevelopment steering committee, was a former director of public housing for the county. She was also a housing organizer and was really bothered by the lack of diversity amongst the leadership and attention to affordable housing issues and other issues that were facing disadvantaged communities in the Silver Spring area. So she began Impact Silver Spring in order to train and support more diverse community leaders to take on more leadership roles in county boards and agencies, particularly those regarding redevelopment. Here you see one of their many campaigns, this one called Silver Spring Loves Renters, which was a tenant organizing campaign, as many of the apartments in Silver Spring did not have any kind of tenant organizing in place or tenant organizations in place. But even so, redevelopment had already taken a toll on affordable housing and small businesses in the downtown by the time that Impact was beginning to organize. The county's heavy-handed approach had both contributed to both direct and indirect displacement of both residents and businesses. So while there was almost no discussion of gentrification and displacement in the redevelopment planning from the county side, it was a predominant concern for many minority and immigrant residents and businesses in Silver Spring. The county had an almost laser-like focus on attracting large-scale commercial chains into the downtown and countering their downtown Silver Springs reputation as an affordable housing warehouse that minimized the real affordable housing concerns that residents had. So by the early 2000s, when Impact is beginning its work, you already see the impacts of displacement. You see how rents rising in housing, landlords not renewing their leases or investing in their properties, and rising housing prices across downtown Silver Spring. These small businesses really bore the brunt of many of the impacts. You saw direct displacement in terms of eminent domain, construction disruption, and rising commercial rents, and many speculative leasing practices. And many of the businesses were actually relocated from the sort of core of the downtown as the county began to buy up and assemble some of that land to the outer edge of Silver Spring. So they saw reduced foot traffic and then competition with the national chains that were relocated into the core of downtown Silver Spring. And more recently, you've heard concerns about industrial displacement, as many of the former auto repair shops that line Georgia Avenue have been replaced by new residential condos and larger commercial chains, and a rezoning of that industrial land. Impact Silver Spring, again, begins to organize and to raise more diverse voices in the process, but their activism was really hamstrung and came about too little and too late to have a really significant impact on the redevelopment plans. Given Frankie Blackburn's history and housing, they focused more on tenant organizing and less on businesses that were really bearing the brunt of the redevelopment. They lacked capacity and established relationships in the area. There wasn't any much tenant organizing previous to that, and many had a distrust over Impact's larger connections to the county. In fact, some of the county funding that they were receiving at the time. And their focus on redevelopment was really short-lived. Following some efforts in downtown Silver Spring, they quickly shifted their focus to capacity building for nonprofit organizations across the county. The county did, however, respond to some of their early calls to do more for small businesses impacted by redevelopment. And this was really catalyzed by Tom Perez, who was the first Latino on the county council, and a former head of CASA, which is an immigrant rights group. And so working alongside of Impact Silver Spring, he sponsored the county's first impact assistance bill to businesses that were directly impacted by redevelopment. However, like Impact Silver Spring's efforts, this bill came about a little too late and too little to really aid many of the affected small minority and immigrant owned businesses, many of whom had already closed or moved out of the core the downtown or out of Silver Spring altogether. This is data looking at what happened to housing prices in Silver Spring, downtown Silver Spring, versus the rest of Montgomery County and the DC metropolitan area as a whole. And DC has some of the highest housing prices in the nation in recent years. And you can see that back when redevelopment began in the early 90s, or the late 90s, there was relative parity between the county, downtown Silver Spring, and the metropolitan area. But even as we've seen these large jumps in housing prices in recent years, downtown Silver Spring has fared far better than either the county or the metropolitan area, and is one of the highest, median in housing prices of any zip code in Montgomery County, which has one of the highest median incomes across the nation. So many now wonder what the fate of downtown Silver Spring will be. It was one of the largest urban renewal efforts ever taken by the state of Maryland and is largely touted as one of its most successful. And as I mentioned, a model of suburban retrofit across the nation. The county invested more than $450 million in public funds in downtown Silver Spring, and often say that the investment was well worth it, as they've been able to generate about $2 billion in private investment since 2000. There's about 5,000 new residential units that were generated in the downtown, including many luxury condos between 2004 and 2014. And office vacancy rates have declined considerably. It's also known to be one of the most diverse suburbs across the nation, and tends to be ranked on many of these diversity indices for cities and suburbs across the nation. But its success has really undergirded the harsh realities that many immigrants and Black and Brown communities continue to face around ongoing redevelopment in the downtown. Much has already been lost, and disadvantaged groups continue to struggle for a place in the downtown. Many who I spoke to said that Silver Spring is more ethnically than economically diverse, and the disparities continue to grow. It's still highly segregated, and residents don't share space across its various communities. And many non-white residents say they don't feel particularly welcomed in the new downtown. Affordable housing and small businesses continue to be threatened with rising housing prices that are growing faster than the county median and the metropolitan average, and commercial rents that continue to rise, but also new revitalization plans for places like Fenton Village, which I have pictured here, where many of the businesses who used to be located in the core of downtown have relocated. And you can see the kind of density that is just creeping on the Fenton Village neighborhood, where many of those businesses now exist. So while ongoing redevelopment really threatens this kind of fragile diversity of downtown, the organizing, both from the top and the bottom, that once spurred a kind of greater engagement of diverse residents and policies has really waned in downtown Silver Spring. So Impact Silver Spring, while it continues to exist as an organization, is no longer active in redevelopment on organizing in downtown Silver Spring. Tom Perez went on to serve in national politics and is one of the leaders in the Democratic National Convention now. And instead, you've seen a kind of bottom-up planning amongst millennials, but not the kind of clear political and engaged politics that you saw around redevelopment as before, even though redevelopment is continuing. So part of the larger project is to ask sort of what it means to move towards a right to suburbia, taking cues from Marxist geographer David Harvey, asking and here in his quote, when he defines the right to the city as a right to change ourselves by changing the city, which depends on the exercise of collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. So here I'm asking about what it means to change, for residents to change themselves by changing the suburbs, and to collectively reshape the processes of suburbanization, and what lessons Silver Spring might hold. So here I've just listed some of what I think are some of the early lessons out of Silver Spring, what I would call suburban school of hard knocks, as this is not exactly a successful case study of equitable suburban organizing, but I think it helps to show some of the kind of spatial dynamics that contribute to the particularly the magnified role of the state or the county in redevelopment politics and the displacement concerns that residents face. And how narratives, particularly those narratives driven by the old school activists, really dominated the process of redevelopment and drove the uneven politics that ensued. So there's questions about the sort of underlying logics of white security and comfort, and notions about good suburban development that dominated the discussions, and these the traditional power imbalance between more traditional suburban activists and the grassroots kind of organizing capacity that we saw with Impact Silver Spring and the role of an activist county council leader. And ultimately, you see the roots, the beginnings of a more sophisticated suburban toolkit in the form of the small business impact assistance that was given to downtown Silver Spring businesses, but ultimately the toolkit of suburban equitable development is still being shaped and driven by these kind of equitable development politics on the ground, and are yet to significantly reach the scale of both direct and direct impacts to both commercial and residential businesses in places like Silver Spring. Thank you so much.
With that, I'm going to hand it over to Geronimo and Isabella.
Thank you very much for both your presentations. Yeah, those are, I did enjoy thinking about the parallels, but I kind of, yeah, I think, I'm trying to think. My first, definitely first question there, it's a little bit of a nuts and bolts one there for Allison Hirsch. Your presentation was really, you kind of mentioned it there, which I thought was really interesting, was the FLC targeting of indigenous groups in Oaxaca specifically. And I'm really wondering, specifically, I'm interested in the legacy of this legacy of the Green Revolution in places like Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Michoacan. But I'm curious about where I could find this documented. And obviously it'll be in your book, but I would love to know like a little bit more about this specific practice of the FLC targeting of indigenous groups. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy. I mean, I'm happy to send you the documentation we've been trying to uncover slowly. Again, thank you, Willow. I had to get a chance to say thank you. I think there's a lot of parallels and a lot of things we can discuss across our papers. But in terms of actually a difference and a response to Geronimo is the undocumented population is clearly, it compounds challenges in terms of advocacy and activism and capacity building because of the invisibility, the sort of almost deliberate invisibility of this population. And to respond to your question about farm labor contractors, I don't mean to actually singularly demonize them because I shouldn't, but there is a sort of reputation that they've developed through time for practices of exploitation of populations that are the most vulnerable, in the sense that they are from regions of Mexico, indigenous regions of Mexico. So they're already, the sort of quote unquote victims of sort of state-sponsored programs like NAFTA, other forms of violence from within their communities or coming pressures from outside targeting their communities. And I think what the FLCs have identified is that there actually are sort of familial community networks from different parts of Oaxaca and Guerrero that are already in the San Joaquin Valley and the larger Central Valley. So it's interesting to see that there are actually sort of growing communities from these regions that are from the same town. And there's a fair amount of sort of anthropological research about working within those communities to sort of understand how they moved from one place to the other. And it was large, I mean, to be honest, a lot of it was through farm labor contracting, in the sense that there are these sort of binational networks that they've created, but also recognizing that because they're a vulnerable population, in the sense that they are oppressed in their own country and are also sort of dually or compoundedly more oppressed in the sort of farming system or the economic system in the US, that they are willing to take these risks to get to the US to work for minimal wages, and often circumstances that sort of work around regulations that are in place to protect the workers. And so I guess I want to speak carefully, because the farm labor contractors as a totality are certainly not the sort of demon here, but have created a structure where there are people that are most at risk for forms of exploitation that are really bearing the brunt of it because of these sort of state-sponsored and economic conditions in place. And racist conditions in place, which are all institutionalized clearly.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. I can send you, actually, I'm happy to send you some of the anthropological research that's been done in some of these communities.
That would be amazing. I think that tracing these, the reasons why the anthropological and ethnographic histories of our places, I think it's just so, it really is fascinating how places can relate to each other in this larger idea of landscape studies. Yeah, and totally. Thank you very much, Professor.
I will say one more thing, just I don't want to occupy too much of it, is that this is, I will say, my research has been a fair amount on the ground. Largely, I mean, COVID has actually created some interesting challenges, especially to direct interaction with communities on the ground. Yes. I've been able to interface with a lot of community leaders over Zoom. But I will say that the indigenous populations, farm working populations, are sort of the hardest to work with, and in the sense that they've stayed deliberately off the radar. There are organizations that are working to advocate for them and with them, but again, it is a question of the sort of protection of privacy.
Absolutely, I think that's definitely true. I think you have to be very careful when asking people, those types of questions. I'll come back to that. Actually, I have some. For Professor Long, I was very interested in your idea about kind of challenging traditional myths about advocacy groups, older advocacy groups in this area. I recently read a book by Logan called Historic Capital, about the historic preservation initiatives in the Washington, D.C. area. And I'm really curious if you could expand a little bit about some of those. You definitely did mention issues of white comfort in some of these areas, and some of the, I guess I think it's really important to kind of hear some of these traditional ways that historic preservation maybe has been misused in the challenging, and how to challenge these ideas. If you could expand a little bit, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so in downtown Silver Spring, there is a historical society, and the historical society has brought some of these narratives around the 1920s, suburban downtown, this period in which downtown was really seen as thriving, and as I said, the downtown of the northern suburbs. And so this historic preservation has really focused on that narrative of downtown Silver Spring, which really ignores the fact that many communities that weren't present in downtown Silver Spring during the period, the many ways in which African Americans in particular were excluded from the downtown. So even like Tasty Diner, which I showed the picture of, African Americans weren't allowed to go into Tasty Diner and were only able to get food from the back of Tasty Diner, including many of those communities who lived just across, well, it wasn't even really a border because it was an unincorporated portion of the county, but in the community of Littonsville, that was, as I said, was subject to sort of multiple forms of urban renewal, denied county services, was sort of industrially served as a haven for industrial zoning, and had a lot of environmental injustices, but also sort of ignores the role of African Americans and others during other periods of time in which there is a more significant presence of these communities. So, you know, you have some really interesting businesses that start in Silver Spring during the 1970s, African American owned businesses, from dry cleaners to restaurants that are largely ignored in the larger narrative of history that is sort of not only whitewashed and sanitized, but really not one that embeds any kind of sort of sense of contest over the landscape during many of these periods of time. That historic narrative has been challenged sort of over and over again by activists who say, you know, we're not represented in this version of history, but this version of history sort of consistently drives sort of the politics over what should be preserved in downtown, what is legitimate for preservation. So for instance, like one of the apartment complexes that was built with FHA funds in the 1930s receives an application for historic designation. And of course, this was FHA funds in the 1930s in which African Americans were redlined out of these communities, and specifically the source of funding from these communities. So it's a very contested history, but largely the narrative that's often painted in terms of historic preservation isn't one that acknowledges that contest.
Absolutely. I think one of the tools that we have maybe for changing this would be historic context statements that are a little bit more inclusive, I guess, from a planning perspective, sometimes to help engage more voices in what is to be preserved and how to be preserved and what should and shouldn't be preserved, where these things are going. But I think one of the big challenges to that is how do you engage certain groups in the writing of these context statements sometimes. And I realize that's a little bit of a nuts and bolts kind of question in this case, but I think it's fascinating and difficult to have people engage when it's a private movement towards preservation in communities that have been traditionally marginalized. So people aren't necessarily engaging with with the civic structures that push preservation, for example, in these places. So I'm just curious if you found any progressive, like, engagement of different narratives of, like you said, the Latino population that was living in these places. Or is there any effort in this area to engage them in some kind of context revision process?
Yeah, there's been a lot of histories written of the Littonsville community, and a large effort to sort of broaden the history of Silver Spring, downtown Silver Spring, to actually include this community that was literally across the tracks. And so, you know, the B&O Railroad went directly through and cut off downtown Silver Spring from this larger community that literally worked in the houses and the business in Silver Spring, but couldn't live there. So there's been a lot of grassroots historic preservation efforts of downtown Silver Spring, which is, or not of downtown, of the Littonsville community, which is again threatened by displacement from a larger light rail line. So there's been a lot of active efforts to sort of recapture that history, but also to incorporate that history into the larger history of downtown Silver Spring. So this bridge that was literally built over the tracks and was the gateway for residents to go from downtown Littonsville to downtown Silver Spring. There's been efforts to preserve that bridge and contextualize the bridge as literally a bridge that in some ways was a bridge of that community to larger opportunities outside of the neighborhood, but also provided a haven for African Americans from the kind of violence that occurred on the other side of the bridge. So there are efforts to sort of reinterpret the narrative, but it also brings about larger questions about not only what you preserve, but also when you preserve, like for most residents of downtown Silver Spring, their narratives in the traditional downtown of Silver Spring doesn't really start until the 1970s. And so when you go back to the 1930s and 20s and say these are the only periods in which we're going to look at for historic value, then it ignores sort of the everyday realities of business, of residents who weren't allowed to occupy these communities during the period. So there's been larger contest over sort of when do we sort of begin our narrative as a community, and who do we include in that?
That's great. Yeah, I think it just summed up a big issue. It's a story again and again and again around the country, and I think you just basically summed it up there, how it can be told about the challenges facing preservation in its current form.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I really found them super fascinating. Allison, I'm from California, so it was really interesting learning about that history and narrative of the Central Valley. I'm from Ventura and Oxnard area, so there's a lot of that there, of agriculture and stuff, but it was really awesome to hear more in depth that narrative that I didn't really know too much about. And then for Willow, right now in my studio, we're talking about like designing in the Green New Deal. So it's been super interesting also learning about how the New Deal exacerbated a lot of these racial injustice patterns, and how that the Green New Deal will put racial justice at the forefront of its goals. Can you talk a little bit about how the Green New Deal fits within, development in the future and communities of color?
Well, I'm a big Green New Deal fan. So I think as a piece of visionary legislation, I think it is incredibly powerful, and one that I would love to see actually, get a budget and work out some of the finer details of how we actually get to this vision. But I think it's fundamentally a critique of the original New Deal, right? That left so many people out as it propelled the wealth of a certain segment of the population and left a huge portion behind. So from FHA loans that helped propel the suburbanization of the United States and the U.S. to emerge as a suburban nation, and that tied to growing wealth and actually the building of the middle class through home ownership, to the VA loans that were given almost exclusively to returning white veterans and denied to African Americans, and the kind of other GI benefits that were given in terms of education and job opportunities for white returning veterans. And all of that history is very much present tense history in many of the suburban communities in which I look at, and really is propelling some of the conflicts that is actually taking place on the ground. I mean, these were white middle class oftentimes working to middle class communities right? Whose wealth was really perpetuated by these New Deal policies that were fundamentally exclusive and racist policies. And now you have a very different demographic change happening, and very rapid demographic change happening in many of these communities. And many of these, the contest sort of happens between this group of long-term homeowners who sort of see themselves as pulling themselves up from their bootstraps, when really they were the recipients of a large amount of federal welfare to the suburbs, but really see themselves as having grown these communities from the grassroots themselves, which actually defies the reality. But that control over that narrative and the control over their visions of their communities really do drive a lot of the contests that you see now.
I have a question from Taylor for Allison. So here we go. Is there any fear for migrant communities that comes with the transparency of their conditions when we live in a xenophobic political climate? And do you have any thoughts on what happens to migrant communities in our speculative futures of more sustainable small-scale agriculture? What does cooperative ownership look like for people with no political sovereignty in this country? It's a complex one.
Well, she really dug right in, which is great. I mean, it's, you know, you're recognizing immediately what the most challenging aspect of reimagining the San Joaquin Valley is. But in terms of, yes, I mean, I think that she's clearly recognizes that, yes, there is an enormous amount of fear of deportation, of you know, disbanding families, of, you know, just living under the radar completely. And, you know, obviously in the past 4 years and beyond that, it's been exacerbated, that fear. In terms of cooperative ownership, there are, you know, there's a lot of faith being put into pathways to citizenship. But I think that, I mean, honestly, the collectivity of these familial networks that already exist, I think could be optimized in some way, recognizing that there's a sort of increasing representation in certain geographies that I think could work in the favor of some of these farm workers, in the sense of, you know, having these sort of social capital or community ties in some ways, just through pure sort of representative bodies. But clearly, yes, I think that's totally true. They don't have any, I mean, honestly, these workers are living in the county. And I think there's a distinction. I mean, actually, even in Willow's talk, there's a real distinction between the county and the city. In the county, all of these unincorporated areas are, their representative body are county officials, and they are elected by those who have the capacity to put them in power, and they are not representative of the majority of their population outside the sort of urban environment. And so, I mean, there is a huge effort by organizations working on the ground to shift that political narrative, to actually build political capacity in communities and how to move them towards a path of actual political representation. And so, you know, that I mean, this is all sort of a political fight, so that the question is really appreciated in the sense that, you know, physical transformation will follow on the heels of a political transformation. And so it really needs to come from a restructuring of the political system or the political network in the San Joaquin Valley. And I don't have the answers to it, but I'm definitely working my way through it.
Great.
That was my way of getting around that question. I don't know, but I recognize that this is a really good question.
Yeah, no, she's always sharp. So a similar question from Taylor for you, Willow. Well, some overlaps, I guess. What are some of the ways that designers and planners can empower these communities and make sure they have a seat in the conversation about their futures? Do they face barriers when invited to join our conversations about redevelopment? For example, is there something about our existing process of community engagement that they find inaccessible? And should we reimagine how we proceed with community outreach?
Yeah, great question. I think the community engagement around downtown Silver Spring really was funneled through many of these structures of traditional suburban organizing, you know, so the neighborhood associations, the chambers of commerce that were really held by the old guard, by the middle class, by white elites in downtown Silver Spring. And so these were sort of the venues for this Silver Spring Steering Committee. They were the venues of outreach for the broader process of planning for the future of downtown. These were not organizations that many immigrants, many African Americans were members of, and actually had pretty fractured relationships with them. So the businesses in Fenton Village, for instance, tried to go to some early Silver Spring Chambers of Commerce meetings and just said, you know, they didn't really feel like these were the venues that really represented their interests, but yet there was no Fenton Village Business Association. There were few tenant associations in downtown Silver Spring, which would have been a venue to outreach to more of the marginalized populations. None of that outreach sort of really occurred in the planning for downtown Silver Spring outside of the organizing efforts of Impact Silver Spring, which was really about getting more of these diverse voices to the table. In contemporary suburban, in the contemporary downtown Silver Spring, there's been a lot more sort of grassroots efforts at planning by a more diverse segment of sort of millennials that are doing some creative things in downtown Silver Spring, little pop-up planning and engagement efforts that I think are sort of meeting communities where they're at. The county has a really good outreach director now, who is one of the first Latinos to serve in that position. He goes door to door to all the businesses regularly. He's kind of known as the mayor of Silver Spring and is really like out there in the community. So I think some of these alternative ways of sort of thinking about community engagement are actually having an impact in terms of generating voice and participation. But how that makes its way up the larger chain of politics is yet to be seen in downtown.
It's great, an unfolding story to say the least. I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of the School of Architecture and Environment for taking their time to participate today, and super appreciate it.